Hello.
Hey, John.
Hey. How are
I'm
you?
Andy. Good. Good to, if this
Whatever
is
we call it.
meeting, yeah, good to meet you.
Likewise. Likewise.
So let's
Oh,
see. Some of the other panelists, the other librarians are jumping on right now. I see Lindsay, Lucy, and Catherine. I think there's a couple, maybe three more people who are going to be joining us.
all right. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Hi, John.
Hi.
Hi.
So you're in Washington, right?
Yeah, I live on Bainbridge Island, which is right off Seattle. So it looks not totally dissimilar from where you are, actually. We've got the rain going right now.
Right.
So yeah. Yeah.
I have
We've got
some
a,
friends from Maine who traveled there this summer and they drove through 23 different states to
Oh
get
my God.
there and back.
Wow. That must have been great.
That's what they said.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd love to do that with my kids sometime. I don't know if they have the willpower for it right now, though. Yeah. So, Andy, I was thinking of maybe just reading the first couple pages of the book as just sort of as an introduction. It seems like it's a good way to situate people, and then I I don't feel compelled to read a whole lot more than that. But if you want, there's some other things I could read too, or if things come up in the course of the conversation. I just didn't know how you wanted to organize it.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds great. I have an intro here and a whole bunch of questions that we can either get to or not, depending on how things go. But yeah, that sounds great. If you want to read a little bit just to sort of like introduce things, introduce people. I'm gonna try and not give away like any spoilers because like I don't. A lot of the people haven't even gotten their copies of the book yet.
Sure.
So there's a lot of people signed up, and way more people than we have copies of books so far. Um, so I'm gonna try and not give away anything, but
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, what I don't feel like there's too much, strictly spoiler stuff, but yeah. Don't worry about that on my account. But
okay.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't. Maybe I'm not the best judge, So yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask about this, but you do that that sort of like our town thing where you kind of early on in introducing characters where you kind of like, I wouldn't call it a spoiler, but you kind of like give us a heads up about what's coming.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that might be a good thing to explain to people. But yeah. I mean, yeah. I guess especially if I'm going to read the first bit, then it starts the same way the play starts. So that you know. But oh yeah, I'm not too picky about how these things go. Usually it's really just gratifying that intelligent people want to talk about the book I wrote. So it's whatever questions you have, I'm pretty delighted to answer. So
Well, yeah, we've got so many people that are signed up between the three libraries, so we're super excited. I just heard from one of the local bookstores that's working with us on it. They've been selling copies of the book, and yeah, people are really excited.
that's great. That's so gratifying to hear. I mean, thank you guys so much for organizing this. It's it's an honor. Like I always see these community programs, and it's really a thrill to be at the center of one of them. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for agreeing to it. Yeah, we were super excited. We've never done this before, and yeah, we just kind of,
Oh wow, I didn't realize that. Oh, that's
this is
great.
our first community read. Yeah, you're the very first. Have you ever done a community read, like participated or had your book in one, or?
No, I mean, I did a couple of like at colleges, like a freshman class type of thing, which is the same idea, but obviously it's, they're all 18. So yeah, and that's been really fun, and it's interesting just to see when you have that many people, the variety of perspectives you get is really fascinating. So yeah, I don't know. I find it interesting. Like there's no no one can say anything wrong, right, about what I what I wrote. I just kind of like to sit back and hear however people connected to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know how many of our panel. I don't know. Is Nancy's not here yet, but I know Nancy has read the book, and Nancy is the director of one of the libraries, Scarborough Public Library, and she read the book, and maybe Catherine or Lucy, you guys can speak to this better than I, but apparently she like had a personal connection to it, which I thought was kind of cool.
Oh, wow.
Well, she has some original newspapers from that time that she was hoping to share maybe at some point tonight.
Oh, great. Yeah. Yeah, I guess I've got a couple things. I'm in my office right now, so I've got a couple things too. Like I've got this, this was Jeannie's campaign poster,
Oh, wow.
and she ran for office, and I don't know, if things come up, I can do some show and tell. I got her press pass around here somewhere too. Oh, here it is. Yeah. Very unglamorous. That'd do it, in Anchorage in 1964. So.
Was it one of the original press passes that were issued in different colors after the earthquake?
No, this was just her. I didn't find any of those, unfortunately. This was, I don't know where this came from, but it was just mixed in among her things. But I did find a lot of the original telegraphs though that she was reading, that were coming into after the first couple of days when the civilians were sending telegraphs. There were stacks of those different places, and yeah, it was amazing. It was just such an eerie feeling to find all these artifacts.
Yeah, reading about all of them, and then reading in the notes section about like the LP and like all these different things. I was just sort of like, as a person that's like really big into like physical like media, like books and things like that, it was just sort of like salivating at like, oh my god, like that LP, like that must be so cool.
Yeah,
like,
well here it is.
Hey, that's awesome.
Wow.
So the artwork
so
cool. is pretty amazing, actually. Yeah, I mean, I can only hope that I kind of stumble into another trove of stuff like that somewhere at another point in my career. I wonder if I just got really spoiled my kind of first real crack at history. But yeah, I still don't really. It's moving. It's just moving to think about all that stuff that I don't know what would have become of it if I hadn't found it. Honestly, I don't know what's become of it now. At last I heard her daughter was going to just chuck a lot of it once I was done. So that could have happened.
So let's see. It is just about 7 o'clock. I'm sure people are going to continue to jump on throughout. Are you okay to wait for like another 2 or 3 minutes before we get going?
Sure. Whatever you need.
Okay. People usually take a few minutes to get settled on Zoom.
Yeah.
And one of our attendees, Jessica, has just put in the chat that she thinks Jeannie's picture reminds her of Lisa Murkowski from Alaska. So
yeah,
I can see that. They kind of got the same haircut for sure. Maybe that's an Alaska thing.
Yeah, I finished the book recently, and then I was listening to the daily podcast, and it was just great to hear her voice.
Yeah, I was so glad that they wanted to do that because I had all that audio, and it was the same thing. It was all just sitting on my computer. Yeah, the cheekbones. Yes, for sure.
So
yeah,
I'm sharing my newspapers. Let's see if I can.
Oh yeah. What paper is that?
That's the LA Times.
Okay.
I lived in Los Angeles, and this was one of the things that I was fascinated by. So I saved some of that week's articles.
Amazing. Yeah, I haven't. I mean, I've seen that in the archives, I'm sure, but I never saw physical copies of a lot of those papers. That's great.
I'm not sure, Nancy, if that speaks to you as a hoarder or you as a librarian or somewhere in between the two.
I grew up and stopped doing it, but I have some really fun stuff from when I was in school, when I was young, in quotes. But I'm sure it has something to do with my librarian bent.
Right.
And disaster management, which I also have an interest in now.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So it is just a little after 7. So why don't we go ahead and get started? We have whole bunch of people here, and people might continue to jump on, and that is totally fine if they want to do that. So I want to welcome everybody that is out there in the audience. Thank you so much for being here and for being a part of this community read. This is the first time we have ever done a community read. And certainly, as far as I'm aware, the first time the three libraries, Thomas Memorial in Cape Elizabeth, Scarborough Public, and South Portland Public, have sort of collaborated like this. So glad to be working with them. I want to say welcome and hello to my coworker, Megan, here at Thomas Memorial, and then Lucy and Catherine from, and Nancy from Scarborough Public, and Lindsay and Tyla from South Portland. So hello to everybody. I hope everyone out there in the audience sees their favorite local librarian or least favorite local librarian. And yeah, so I want to welcome everybody for out in the audience. And I want to introduce the reason we're all here. Jon Mooallem is a writer at large for the New York Times Magazine, where he's been a contributor since 2006. You can read a whole bunch of his writing, maybe all of his writing, from the New York Times Magazine and some other publications on his website at jonmooallem.com. And I highly recommend that you do that. It's all so great. I've read most of it, and there's just great stuff on there, including an article called, I think, Needle in a Crap Stack. Is that right?
Yeah.
Which highly recommend, just on the title alone. So that's at jonmooallem.com. Jon's first book was published in 2013. It's called Wild Ones, a sometimes dismaying, weirdly reassuring story about looking at people, looking at animals in America. And it was chosen as the best book of the year by New York Times Book Review, The New Yorker, and NPR's Science Friday. Again, I cannot recommend that book highly enough. It's one of my favorite books, and I have probably pressed it into the hands of countless members of the audience here tonight. So if you haven't read that one yet, absolutely get it from the library. It's so good. Jon is also the creator of the Walking podcast, which, if you've never heard of it, Google it. It's worth checking out. I won't even attempt to describe it. Jon, if you choose to, that's up to you. But I feel like it's one of those things people just kind of have to stumble on and experience. So Google that, Walking podcast, Jon Mooallem. Jon's also a writer for Pop-Up Magazine, a live magazine performed on stage. You can find some of that on YouTube, and also if you go to Pop-Up Magazine's website. Really cool stuff, really cool program. You may have also heard Jon on This American Life or read his past column in Wired Magazine. And if you all aren't familiar with some of these things, we're hopefully going to be sharing some of these with you over the course of the read. There's a really, really excellent bit from This American Life about a drunken moose, which is one of my favorites. So we're going to be sharing some of this stuff to get you a little bit fuller taste of Jon's writing. So Jon's new book, which is the reason we're all here tonight, is This Is Chance, which was published in March. And we are so excited to have him joining us here tonight for the kickoff of our first ever community read. So welcome, Jon Mooallem.
Thanks. Thank you, Andy. And thank you everyone for joining this. And thank you to all the wonderful libraries. I was saying earlier, it's a real thrill to be chosen as the center of one of these programs. I love it. I love that these happen around the country. So it just feels really special, and I'm really honored. Thank you.
So Jon, I know you are going to read a little bit from the book. I just wanted to throw out a really quick first question there, just in case anybody is coming to this totally new to the book. And I know how I've been describing the book to people, and I feel like I do a really bad job of it, because like on the surface, it's about an earthquake that happened, 5+ decades ago. But I feel like that doesn't really do it justice, because it's about so much more than that, and I find it so relevant to everything that's going on in our world right now. So I'm curious, how do you describe this book? What do you say that it's about when you're telling people about it?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's very astute. I think it was, compared to my first book, it was a very easy book to describe, because I could just say it's about this earthquake that happened in Alaska in 1964. it's it was a 9.2 earthquake, and it was terrible. And the book tells the story of the first 3 days after the earthquake, which happened on Good Friday night. And it reconstructs that mostly around the character of Jeannie Chance, who was a radio reporter at the time, a working mother of 3 children, who through a little circumstance, but also kind of her own pluck, managed to be at the center of a lot of the recovery work that weekend. But I think that you're right, is that the further I got into the story, I realized that that was sort of the narrative, that was the story that I was telling. But everywhere that I looked in this story, there were other just amazing, really moving characters and stories, and some really, I thought, almost like kind of spiritual questions that the story was animating, about how we deal with a world that is volatile, and that, when change happens in an instant, in unexpected ways, how do we as individuals and as communities, begin to make sense of those disruptions and begin to adjust.
Yeah, that it's funny that you say that about how this one is so much easier to describe, because as I've been pressing Wild Ones on people, usually what I say is just read it. Like, you're gonna love it, just read it, because it's that one is super hard to understand, as if the subtitle didn't make that evidence, didn't evidence that. But yeah,
it
so
was nice
one,
to have a crisp elevator pitch for this one, and to really just be able to, just as a writer too, it's helpful for me, I think, because my mind kind of likes to go in lots of different directions. It's helpful for me to say, okay, here's the rules. I'm telling this story mostly about, this small group of people in this compact amount of time. And then within those, there's always, wrinkles and questions and tensions to explore.
So that question asked, did you want to read a few pages from the book?
Yeah, sure. I thought, you asked if there was something I could read, and I thought the best thing might be just to read the first couple pages, because it just sort of sets up a lot of what we were just talking about. And being that I know you guys are just starting the program, it might be nice to kind of just raise the curtain on the world of Anchorage in 1964. So these are the very first pages of the book. This book is called This Is Chance. It was written by Jon Mooallem, published by Random House, edited by Andy Ward. It tells the story of a single catastrophic weekend in a faraway town, and of the people who lived through it. Ordinary women and men who, when the most powerful earthquake ever measured in North America struck, just before sundown on Good Friday, 1964, found themselves thrown into a jumbled and ruthlessly unpredictable world they did not recognize. They would spend the next few days figuring out, together, how to make a home in it again. The name of the town is Anchorage, Alaska, a blotch of Western civilization in the middle of emptiness. In those days, the state of Alaska was still brand new and often disregarded as a kind of free-floating addendum to the rest of America. But Anchorage was Alaska's biggest and proudest city, a community whose essential spirit, one visitor wrote, reached aggressively and greedily to grasp the future, impatient with any suggestion that such things take time. It was a modern-day frontier town that imagined it was a metropolis, straining to make itself real. That determination made it difficult for those living in Anchorage to recognize how indifferently the city they were building could be knocked down, to imagine that early one Friday evening, the very ground beneath them might rear up and shake their town like a dog shaking an animal he's killed, as one man later described it. Even while the earth was moving, the ferocious strangeness of what was happening to Anchorage was hard for people to internalize or to accept. Buildings keeled off their foundations, slumped in on themselves, split in half, or sank. 4-foot-high ground waves rolled through the roads as though the pavement were liquid. A city of infallible right angles buckled and bent. It wasn't as though before the quake people in Anchorage pictured these things happening and dismissed them as impossible. They just never pictured them. They couldn't. More to the point, why would they? Like all of us, they looked around and registered what they saw as stable and permanent, a world that just was. But there are moments when the world we take for granted instantaneously changes, when reality is abruptly upended and the unimaginable overwhelms real life. We don't walk around thinking about that instability, but we know it's always there. At random, and without warning, a kind of terrible magic can switch on and scramble our lives. As Life magazine would put it afterward, struggling to explain the hidden volatility that caused the quake, somewhere the earth is quivering all the time.
Wow, thank you. So the obvious question, where did the idea for the book come from?
Yeah, I mean, there's a much longer way to tell this story, but I'll spare you. I mean, it came completely through accident and synchronicity, which turned out to be kind of appropriate because that's a lot of what the book is about. But many years ago, I guess it was in 2002 or three, I was camping with a friend in a town called Crescent City in near the California-Oregon border, and just we happened upon this scrapbook in a diner there that was chronicling the kind of destruction of this town in 1964 by tsunami. And there was something so moving about seeing a town that was, just riven by disaster, and then the way they came together and tried to recover. And I always just sort of thought about it, as, oh, maybe one day I'll figure out, what the story there was and write about it. So it took me about 13 years to just Google it finally. One day I was just completely out of ideas, I guess. And I never thought like, well, what made the tsunami? I didn't think in cause and effect terms. I just thought tsunamis just happened. And it turned out the tsunami was caused by this earthquake that had happened in Alaska on that Good Friday evening. And once I started reading about the earthquake, I quickly discovered this woman, Jeannie Chance, who had played just such an important role and such a curious role, working on the radio that weekend. And got in touch with her daughter, who is really her only surviving family. And it turned out that Jeannie had just saved everything, boxes and boxes of her, her entire life, basically, including a lot of the recordings from that weekend in Anchorage, as she was broadcasting what was known about the earthquake at the time and doing lots of other work on the radio. So, as a writer, when you come across just material like that, that's literally sitting in someone's basement, untouched, and you see the way this story is just unfolding, across it, albeit in a very messy, disorganized way. I got a little tingling feeling, and I just knew that this was the story I really wanted to tell.
So this morning I overheard a conversation between a couple people who were participating in the read, and they were wondering why this particular book was chosen. And so to me, the answer to that is this book was published March 24th, which is 1 week to the day after Thomas Memorial Library closed down due to the pandemic. So I started reading this book, and at that time, in the beginning of the pandemic, it seemed like the book was like the perfect book for that moment in time, because at that point in the pandemic, it seemed things felt really different than they feel now, where you were kind of seeing like the best that people had to offer. And there was a lot of like mutual aid and kindness and gratitude and, cheering on the frontline workers. And so reading this as Chance during that time, it really resonated about what can happen in a community of any size, I guess, during however you define community, during a moment of crisis like that. So I'm wondering if you saw those parallels, if you see those parallels between the earthquake in 1964 and what's going on today with the pandemic, or at least in those early days of the pandemic. Do you see connections, similarities, differences between these moments in time?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously, I was, I had a whole book tour planned, and those couple of weeks, leading up to the publication of the book was really when I think the pandemic was really taking hold in a lot of parts of the country, including, I live outside Seattle. So we had, I think, the first cases, I think it's still true, they believe the first cases, at least diagnosed. And things were, ramping up or ramping down pretty quickly. Things were getting weird really quickly here. And I'd be on the phone with my publisher or my agent in New York, and they'd be saying, yeah, I think you're still gonna, you're gonna fly out here. We're still gonna do all the bookstores. And I'd say, I don't know, guys, like I'm 2 weeks ahead of you basically, and things here are pretty much collapsing. And I think, so to answer your question, I think it really hit me right away. Well, I'm not going to lie. It did not hit me right away. Like I was so absorbed in my own sort of panic over, my own life, that it took people started reaching out to me and saying, I'm reading this book and it's eerie, right? That this whole idea of these sudden disruptions, we were all living through it. And so of course I recognize that. And I still think that's true to some degree. That every day I think it's we talk about sort of that we're all kind of settled into this new reality, but I think in some ways for me at least personally, that's just kind of a story I tell myself, but there's still this kind of chaos that's roiling for me underneath it. And I think we're just the idea that we're living in this world that we couldn't have imagined 6 months ago. In some ways I felt like I had, I worked on this book for 6 years. So in some ways I feel like I had a 6-year head start in just trying to, feel my way into what that's like, because that was what was happening for these people when the earthquake happened, right before sundown on that Friday. So in some ways it's like my book's telling the story of these 3 days when, really all they're doing is just trying to figure out what happened, communication being what it was, and Anchorage being, the kind of place that it was. It took that long just to kind of map out how the city had, what had happened to the city, what was the damage, what was different, what was dangerous, what was safe. I think in some ways we're still in the middle of that weekend, even though we're 6 months in to the pandemic. So just that, in just the most basic way, just that idea of like learning to settle into a world that feels, distorted and wrong. I think it's one of the challenges that we're all facing right now, and that is really the main thrust of the book.
Yeah, there's a quote here, and I cannot remember who said it, but it's from the book, and it says, even now I can look at the solid ground out the window and know that it's not permanent. It can change at any time. It just moves. Everything moves.
Yeah, I mean, that was an attorney in Anchorage named Jack Roderick, who was, I talked to him 2 or 3 years ago, and he was describing, the quake, and he was saying that now, that even this much time later. And I think it's true. I've done some other reporting for the magazine about, I did a story about wildfires last year, I guess it was, in California. And I think that there is something, it's almost like the death of a parent. Like I feel like I'm at the age where some of my friends are starting to lose parents, and there's some of us, including myself, who lost parents, a lot younger. And you sort of know who's who, right? Like that once you pass through that threshold, you sort of have more of a framework to understand, oh, this is death again, this is familiar. And I think disaster works sort of the same way, is that, once you sort of start to see the fallibility of the world around you and the structures that you thought were, indestructible, just kind of dissipate. There's something that happens cognitively where even if you still, can't be bothered to get your earthquake kit together or do kind of practical things, just cognitively, you're kind of situated to feel like it's a little more intelligible, at least when it happens.
There's a comment here from one of the community read members out here, Jessica, who says that was something that struck me in the book. So many people died, not from the earthquake, but way too young and in sort of unnatural ways. If there's ever a natural way, I guess, or like maybe they're all natural ways. It's only a sentence here, a sentence there, where you mention how this person or that died, but it had a cumulative effect. I always say you never know what life will bring, and these deaths brought it home to me.
Yeah, I mean, she's alluding to, I'm sorry, I forget the commenter's name, Jessica. So Jessica's alluding to this, yeah, so I guess I should just explain. So one thing that was happening in Anchorage at the time of the quake was there's a really vibrant community theater scene in Anchorage, which I found just like completely delightful. It was not what, it didn't conform to my kind of maybe a little bit snobby impressions of what Anchorage would have been in 1964 coming. I thought, oh wow, they've got like a whole art scene. That's amazing. So it goes to show me. But yeah, and I just thought that was amazing. And the director of the theater too was just this incredibly larger than life character named Frank Brink, and they were doing the play Our Town that weekend when they were about to start the performance when the quake happened. And so, I guess I won't say too much about it because folks are just probably at the beginning of reading the book, but there's something that happens in the play Our Town where the stage manager character kind of knows how everyone on stage died and will sometimes just kind of tell you offhandedly, like, oh yeah, that kid delivering newspapers, he's going to go off to war in a couple of years and die. And the weirdest thing about working on this project was, I was sort of having those realizations myself, because I would read, in all these documents I had that, interviews at the time and all sorts of things that were made at the time, I would pick out these names and I'd go try to see, if the person was still around, and just, time and again, it's at the point where so many of them had died. And that gave me this kind of weird omniscience about how these stories were going to end, that I was following. And there was just something really moving to me to be able to, in the middle of this very immediate, urgent danger of the earthquake and urgent confusion, to be able to do exactly what Our Town does and just sort of, say where these people are heading. It somehow made that time, those moments seem just much more poignant when you have a sense of where they fell in the arc of a complete life.
Yeah, it's kind of a striking effect, and I mean, Our Town must have impacted you pretty largely, because I mean the structure is sort of based on it, or the style anyway, with the character of Mooalllem kind of as the stage manager, and you have a cast of characters at the beginning. And somebody was telling me when she had started reading the book, she was saying, oh, it's really strange. Like, it starts out with, the section that you just read where it's like, this is the editor and it was published by so-and-so. So how familiar with Our Town were you ahead of time? And at what point did you realize that was kind of like a key to that you wanted to like frame this story around?
Yeah, I mean, to be totally honest, I wasn't familiar with it at all. Like, I'm sure I must have read it in high school or something, and I think I had the impression that I think a lot of people have about the play, that it's sort of, it's something the high school theaters do, and I think it gets unjustly maligned, as something simple or maybe a little hokey. And so I knew that the theater group was doing this play, and I was completely captivated by the theater director and some of the other personalities involved. And it was very hard for me to get access to any of those stories, though. The theater directors passed away a long time ago. I could only find one or two people who had been in the production, and that, they didn't have great memories of much that had happened. So it took me a while to really get the insight that I needed, and I just sort of put off reading the play for, until I got to it. And when I read it, it was, I mean, it's such an amazing piece of work, and it's so strange and experimental in ways that I just didn't expect. But what really moved me was that I think it gave me a way it gave me a frame to think about some things that I'd been feeling. It gave me thoughts to the things that I'd been feeling. Because so much of the play is just telling about this everyday existence in this town where nothing much remarkable happens at all. But there's a kind of cumulative effect where you start to realize how precious those moments are, and that there's this kind of beauty to a community where everyone is interconnected and it's familiar, and that we take that for granted, and that's a real tragedy, that we do walk around in this kind of beautiful existence that we just can't see because it's always right in front of us. And I think the earthquake, people say directly, when you look at the documents, like, people talk about how they suddenly had this awareness that their lives were so fragile and so meaningful in ways that they hadn't been able to recognize before everything was literally shaken up. And so I think there was just a really a beautiful overlay between it was a magnificent coincidence that they were doing that play, because even at the time, I think the people who saw the play, it gave them a way to understand their own experience. And for the purposes of the book, it gave me a way to kind of talk about that experience in a much more maybe poetic way, dealing with a great work of literature than just in people's words at the time too.
Yeah, there's a section about, I want to say it's like about midway through the book, where you kind of allude to like Frank Brink, the theater community theater director, and talk a little bit about our town, just the fact that it's being staged at the college. But then about midway through the book, there's this section, and to me, it struck me as like markedly different from everything that had come before it, because earlier in the book, you were kind of taking us through the days in the moments immediately after the earthquake. And then you get to this section midway through where you kind of like tell the story of our town, and what you just said about how it was sort of like, everybody sort of thinks they know our town, and it's sort of like unfairly maligned, but that it's actually really strange, beautiful play with like a lot of relevance to everyday life. And I just thought that section was just really, I don't know, that for me, like the whole book kind of like hinged on that. And after, it was sort of like the key to the whole book for me. And then I kept seeing other parts where it's like, oh, right, this kind of like, and if I kept our town in mind when I was reading the other parts of the book, it kind of gave them like a deeper resonance.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, maybe, I guess the other way to think about it is maybe I was sort of cheating and like drafting off Thornton Wilder, but which I think is also fair. But yeah, I mean, I just honestly felt like, it was maybe the biggest example of this, but it was definitely not the only example where like I just couldn't really believe that was the play they happened to be doing, and it wasn't like I had to, do all sorts of like sneaky writerly tricks to, introduce all of these kind of big ideas that are in the play, because people were telling me them, people were telling me exactly the sorts of things people say in the play. And then, the play eventually reopens after the quake, and people were telling me about going to the play and having the way that it affected them and the way that it helped them interpret their own experience. So yeah, I just, like I said, it was not the only example of this, but it just, what am I going to do? I'm not going to, write about that. It seemed like such like a moving and unlikely part of the truth. And then, but there it was, it was actually what happened.
It seems like another instance of chance kind of coming together to make this sort of like ideal, bringing together the story and the themes and all this. And that,
well,
that
I mean, and her name is Chance. I mean,
yeah,
her
right.
name is Chance. Is like, I don't know. It's if I had made it up, it would have been a little tacky or something. But
so that kind of leads me to the question that I'm curious about, because I know it started out as a shorter piece that was sort of for radio. It's a way of explaining it concisely. But at what point did you know that it was going to be a book and not a magazine article or a piece for a podcast or something shorter?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was always hoping that it would be, and the question in my mind was always just whether there would be the material to make a book with, like if things had been preserved to the extent and with the right resolution that I could actually tell the kind of story that I wanted to tell, which was just a story about ordinary people going through this experience and what they thought and felt, and not just what was preserved in like a USGS geology report, right? And so it took me several years, actually. I mean, that the podcast that you're talking about was for 99% Invisible, which I collaborated with some musicians to do a story about the earthquake, that we actually did like a little tour of, and then they put it on this podcast. And that was really just a strategic way for me to buy some time to dig deeper into the story and see what was out there and whether it would be possible to write something at length. So that took a while, and a lot of it actually, in addition to Jeannie's things, the material that her family had kept, It was finding this woman who had been like Frank Brink's, right-hand woman in the community theater, who had a lot of his things and could tell his story. And then this third piece, the kind of other main part of the third leg of the stool of the book, is about these sociologists who came to Anchorage right after the quake to study how people were reacting to the disaster. And it took me a while to realize that all of their interviews, that they conducted something like 500 interviews in Alaska over the next 16 months or so. And all of those interviews were also still preserved at their archive in Delaware. So yeah, it took, once I found those things, it was, then I had, months and months of work ahead of me in each case to use that material. But obviously you don't just find it as soon as you start looking. You don't even know what you're looking for.
So as a writer who's written, a journalist, a reporter who's done a lot of stories over the years, is it unusual to find the sort of, like, to me, they seemed like treasure troves, like 30 boxes in Jeannie's daughter's basement, and the interviews from the Disaster Research Center. Was that sort of like, when you found those, was that sort of like, does that happen often in your reporting, or is this sort of like, oh my God, like I have to make a book out of this?
Yeah, no, it was definitely the latter. I mean, the real difference is that most of the work I have written, some about historical subjects before, but most of what I do is go hang out with people and talk to them and annoy them for days, and and just so there's no, there never really feels like, I'm try to be a polite, respectful person, and people generally, welcome me in. And so there never feels like there's a point at which I just won't be able to ask one more question if I need it, or, if there's some information I don't know, there's usually ways you can go get it, right? And if there's not ways to go get it, then you give up. But in this case, it was a little daunting to me, because I knew that there just would be things that I would not know, and would not be recoverable. And I think I just needed the confidence of knowing that there was, enough that I wouldn't regret, embarking on it in a serious way. So yeah, but it did, by the time I was a little deeper into it, it did feel like, it was almost laughable that I had worried that there wouldn't be enough, because, these interviews with sociologists, they're like 40, 50 page transcripts, where basically they would sit down with someone the day after the quake and say, tell me everything that happened, and so the ability to really retrace people's footsteps in this very confined amount of time, it was eerie, in a way that became part of the book too, just like what we can remember and what we can't, and how that's decided.
So I'm curious about how a journalist, a reporter who, as you said, is used to spending a significant amount of time with people, interviewing people, being able to re-interview people, being able to visit places where things are happening or have just happened. How do you sort of like flip that when you're writing about an event that has happened 50 years ago? A lot of the people are deceased or dispersed. The place you're writing about has been totally, recreated in a new way. What is that like as a journalist who wants to go in and wants to ask all these, questions of people, but instead you have to sort of like dig? Was it a different experience than what you're normally used to?
Undoubtedly, yeah. And it was very disorienting and sometimes frustrating. I think, I had a very perfectionist attitude about it, that, I was going to be able to have the same kind of, not omniscience, but the same breadth of knowledge about some of these people that I would someone that I had spent a week with, in real life. And I had to let go of that somewhat, but also I found that some of the same skills that I would use in for a magazine story, a contemporary magazine story, could kind of be adapted. So, for example, Jeannie Chance, who's at the center of the book, she passed away many years ago. I had a lot of her diaries and thoughts and things like that, but I didn't necessarily have the context for them, right? And it was, sometimes it was clear she was, trying to impress someone, and in a letter to a prospective employer, and maybe had been playing it up and things like this. And so what I found was that there were a lot of times when I would come to interview someone who had maybe lived through the quake, and they, everyone had their story of the quake itself. Everyone really remembered where they were at that time and how they spent those 4.5 minutes that the earth was shaking and what they felt and what they saw. And then they didn't, then the story shut off, right? Then they had kind of specific memories about disjointed things, and they had their kind of canned version of the story that they had been telling for 50 some odd years. And so what I found with those people, though, is it was very valuable to just sit with them and just ask questions about what Anchorage was like at the time, or what other people were like. Say, oh, I found this interview with this guy who was a psychology professor, or this person who worked in the public works department, and did you ever cross paths with him? And they might say yes, or they might say no, but I knew this other guy who worked in the public works department, and yeah, they were a bunch of macho, whatever it was. Is you could kind of soak up the ambiance of the town. And as I was drawing conclusions about the people who I was encountering in these static documents, I could say like, oh, you knew Bob, like he seems like he was a little bit arrogant, what? And, oh yeah, Bob was totally, and you could kind of bounce it off, or they'd say, oh no, Bob, he was the most generous guy I ever met. So it was just great, it was like I really considered it a privilege to be able to talk with people about periods in their life, which were often, they often felt real nostalgia for, just being the position, they were a lot younger. They were in a place that really felt like it was up and coming. It had a great spirit to it. Every single person had this great affection for their community at the time, which may have been sort of cemented by the quake and people's, collaborative response to it. But everyone wanted to talk about it, and as someone who's paid to listen to people, that's the best kind of conversation, because it feels like I'm not just taking, it feels like it's generally like a joyous thing for them too.
So I'm curious. There was a phrase that I saw you had mentioned in an interview. You talked about writing this as like being sucked through time. And so I'm curious, because you're writing this in, 2015, 2016, I guess. And you're writing about these things that happened 50 years ago. Some of the people were dead long before you started writing this. What is that experience like mentally, trying to like meet these people that you never actually met and sort of like learn about them? Do you feel kind of like you got to know them a little bit, like through reading diaries and interviews and things like that? What was that experience like?
Yeah, it was strange. Definitely with Jeannie, I just feel like she left so much behind, and so much of it was very intimate, and there were a lot of recordings of her voice. And I spent a lot of time with her daughter, asking questions, hearing stories about the family. So in that case, yeah, I do feel like I know her to some degree. And at the same time, I feel very careful about not wanting to be, arrogant about the degree to which I know her, and really stay conscious of the fact that I don't know her. And I, maybe this isn't the most important wrinkle of that question, but one thing that comes to mind is, for example, I'm writing about a woman who is a, very competent broadcaster, really charismatic person, at a time when, most women who were working in radio were just supposed to have, cooking shows or homemaking shows. And she was this really trailblazing reporter who like was running around town, like, digging up dirt and reporting on crime and things like that. And I think, from a 2020, hindsight is 2020. Well, in the year 2020, like, I think there's we kind of have a lens into a story like that, here in like, we've heard, stories about, kind of iconic feminists. I have these books that I read to my 2 little daughters every night about, just, it's like, there's amazing women in all different fields and walks of life. And I think it was it felt very easy to kind of slot Jeannie's story into that template. And I tried to just stay really conscious in moments like that I wanted to understand how she understood her life and not how we would understand it. I mean, both, but I wanted to portray her as she would have portrayed herself. And, you know, at that time, it was not, you know, she didn't talk about herself as a feminist. She just didn't have that vocabulary yet, even though you know, this was the year Feminine Mystique, I think, came out the year before. It wasn't as though these conversations weren't happening, but they certainly weren't happening in her world, it seems. And so, yeah, I think I was just trying to meet people where they seemed to be at the time, and separate that from, you know, my knowledge of it now. And that was very challenging, but ultimately, like, one of the great pleasures of the project.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about Jeannie, because from the people I've talked to that have read the book so far, she seems to be like one of the main takeaways, as just such a fascinating character. And to me, she seems like so far ahead of her time, and almost like she must have been like kind of out of time or out of place. You talk about it a little bit when she lived in Texas, where all her friends were just kind of like staying at home and being, you know, mothers and wives, and she just really bristled at that. And even when they got to Alaska, she kind of like bristled at or kind of pulled against the constraints of what she was supposed to be, and she ended up just being this like really incredible broadcaster and just person. Like the story that you tell of her in the book, she's just so like she's just like a hero, like a real hero in like the true sense of that word, to do the things that she did. And it just seems so out of place for that time. I've been hesitating to like describe her as a pioneer to people, but it really feels like she was like a pioneer. It was 1964, like that was pretty uncommon, like what she like working outside the home and to the extent that she did. And it seemed like she was really kind of ahead of her time. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, everything you're saying is 100% true. I mean, I think the phrase like ahead of her time always struck me as really interesting, is because you don't know you're ahead of your time when you're in the present, right? It's only in retrospect because you see that society has grown and evolved in ways to meet you where you had been, right? And I think that's exactly what I was talking about earlier. Is you know, I don't think she had the insight, at least in 1964. You know, she really became more of like, you know, a feminist, you know, like in terms of calling herself that and giving speeches about, you know, advocating for other women and things like that. But in 1964, I think she clearly understood that she was not of her time, but I don't think she had the confidence to say, you know, or the certainty to say that she was indicative of some kind of future. And you see that tension again and again because she also, you know, really took pride in her identity as a mother, and she had a lot of angst and guilt and stress about what working at this radio station and being away from her kids, you know, hours of the day, what that was doing to them. And you know, you see kind of all of the tensions that we now sort of understand as being part of a movement, just playing out on the scale of an individual who's kind of isolated from other people like her. And so I just thought that was really interesting. You know, I mean, I can't claim to know what it's like to be a working mother even now. I certainly don't know what it was like in 1964. But given that, I thought it was really fascinating to me to just see it distilled into the life of one person, rather than to try to represent it as, you know, on a societal level, right? So yeah, I think, and that's another thing that I thought was interesting too, is you know, I write some in the book about her life after the quake, and you know, and the rest of her life, and what she did and the kinds of things that she moved into. And that was all really fascinating. In some sense, I think the quake you can see the quake as and the work she did, which I guess we haven't really talked about, but maybe people will just read about it. But the role that she had to assume after the quake as being this pivot point in her life, where she proved to other people, but also I think just unquestionably proved to herself that she should be doing great, important things, and gave herself the license from then on to really pursue them in a less, more of an unabashed way, I guess.
There's a question here from David, one of our attendees, and he wants to know, what was the perspective of Jan, Jeannie's daughter? Did she appreciate her mother's role? And was there a journey in Jan's perspective as you wrote the book?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, you know, in some sense, I still don't know that I can articulate that. I mean, I was so moved by the time that I spent with Jan, because, you know, here's, so Jan was eight years old, I believe, at the time of the earthquake. She's the youngest of 3 kids. Her 2 older brothers have since passed away. And she never really got to know her mom as an adult. No, while Jan was an adult. I mean, she did to some degree, but I think she really felt like, you know, her adult life with her mom was taken away from her when Jeannie died. And so in some sense, I think she was, you know, when I first called her, she was really grateful that anyone wanted to look in these boxes of junk in her basement, because they'd just been this burden to her. She hadn't wanted to throw them out, but she also really couldn't bring herself to look through it all, because, you know, A, it's just a hassle, and B, it was painful to some degree. So I don't think that her opinion of her mother changed through this process, but I think she always really admired her mother, and also was very in touch with her mother's faults as well. You know, she had a very well-rounded perspective on her. But I think it was really meaningful to Jan that anyone cared, you know, and that, because I think, you know, frankly, I think Jeannie saw herself as someone that someone would one day write a book about. She wanted to write a book about herself, which is why she had kept all of these boxes of her things. And I think it was very affirming for Jan to just see that happen to some degree, and it's been really cool for her to see, you know, the wider world learn about her mother too, and in the way you're talking about, just like appreciate her as this woman who like kind of could have been an icon in some way.
Yeah, I just read today in an interview that you had done, you said that you encountered more than one person who sort of said to you like, oh yeah, I've been waiting for someone to call me about Jeannie Chance. Yeah,
I can think of 2 right off the top of my head, and other women who I think really looked up to her as someone who was showing them, you know, the kind of fullness of a life that they could lead. And I think in one case took a lot of inspiration from her career-wise. So yeah, it's, you know, that's, and I'll just say too, I mean, that's like, you know, writing a book's pretty lonely, you know, so you're just sitting stewing in all of this stuff, and you're obsessed with this story, and, you know, my wife's sick of hearing about it, and no one else, like, you know, and like I've got one friend who I'm kind of, you know, keeping in the loop, but everyone else is just thinks I'm blabbering. Any kind of affirmation, like, it just meant so much to me when I would, you know, both about Jeannie, but also just about the quake itself. You know, when people would say like, oh yeah, of course, like you're interested in this. This is like the, you know, the most amazing story or the most amazing person. That was just so great to hear. I remember those examples so clearly.
So I want to ask again about the book and the type of book that this is. So when you write a book like this, or like Wild Ones, how do you describe what you're writing or what you're doing? Are you a journalist? Are you a historian? How do you describe that? And are those things different, and do they intersect?
Yeah, I don't know. I just say I'm a writer or a journalist usually. Somehow I'm a little intimidated to say I'm a historian, just because I love history and I read a lot of, you know, books by people that I would call historians, and I feel like it'd be a little bit hubristic to call myself that, because I'm not trained in it. You know, I sort of just learn as I go. So yeah, I mean, to be honest, I don't attach a ton of importance to that. I mean, I think that the tools, I'm just trying to follow a story, you know, especially in the case of this book. You know, my first book was, it involved a lot of reporting, but the main narrative was sort of just like a narrative of ideas, you know, that I was trying to answer certain questions. And this one, you know, I think in some ways it is actually, you know, despite everything I said at the beginning, like, it is a very straightforward book where it was very just clear to me, when I was writing, that I was, I had the story laid out in front of me. I knew what the beginning and middle and the end, and then I wanted to just, tell certain scenes that happened that got you there. So to me, that's no different from, once I have the knowledge that I need to write the book, once I have the reporting or the research, it's all the same kind of tools.
So there's a great clip on YouTube, just like a minute-long clip of an interview that you gave, and there's this quote here that I want to read. You say, because of the nature of writing that you do, sort of long-form magazine writing, you say, I have the privilege of getting lost in subjects and investigating tangents that may or may not work out, getting confused. I think sometimes people who are working on very tight deadlines, they can't afford to get confused. As soon as they confront something that is difficult or complicated, they have to shut it out so they can keep going straight ahead. I think the essence of what I do is in some ways wandering. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. I love that idea of confusion and getting lost and wandering kind of being an asset. So I'm wondering if you can talk about how you view that as an asset and why, and how that works in your process. Yeah,
I mean, well, it's not profitable. It's, I will say that, just that, as essentially a freelancer, it's not efficient. But the way I feel is like, why do this work if you can't kind of chase your own curiosities sometimes? And I think it's often very alarming, or not alarming is the wrong word, but it's confusing maybe to people that I'm writing about, I'm not just trying to get a soundbite out of them. There's usually there's some kind of barrier I need to break down to actually make them understand that I'm sincerely curious about, things, and I'm going to ask them questions that may or may not lead anywhere, or may or may not deliver me any kind of material. But that to me is the joy of doing it. I think if I didn't, that's just kind of the way I am. I've always been that way. I wonder about things, and I'm extremely patient if I'm trying to figure something out. So that, I mean, to me, it's like, why do this if you're not going to indulge that party? I mean, there's obviously limits. And I do think I've gotten better over the years of recognizing, being a little more efficient and purposeful about the work I do. But I try to leave that intact, because if I didn't want to do that, I would, maybe be working for a nightly TV news, or just a breaking news reporter at a newspaper or something like that. I mean, those are cool jobs, but it just seems like a completely different ball of wax.
So there's a question here from Kate, who wants to know if you lived in Anchorage for a time while you were reporting the book. And I also kind of wanted to fold that into a question of my own about sort of the nitty-gritty. I'm just very curious, having read the book and read through the extensive notes section at the back of the book, I'm sort of curious and mind-boggled about how you go about researching a book like this, where you get materials of all different kinds from all over the place. And I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit about the nitty-gritty of what that actually looks like, researching that, spending time in Alaska, meeting people.
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. So, I didn't live in Anchorage. I mean, the weird thing about it is there wasn't actually a lot to do in Anchorage for me. I went several times. I guess I went up there. I went to Anchorage probably 3 different times, and then I made even more trips to Juneau, which is where Jeannie's daughter was and where all her things were. And that just was a matter of, both spending time with Jan, but also just the time that it took to go through each piece of paper in those boxes. But in Anchorage, it was funny because I took 1 or 2 trips, and I was like, okay, the next one is like my big trip to Anchorage. And I think I was maybe there for 8 or 9 days, and I kind of ran out of things to do because there weren't that many people around that had lived through the quake anymore, and I met with as many of them as I could. And a lot of what I really did, which was actually really, really valuable, was just walked. For example, there's a long sequence in the book that sort of shows you it just follows Jeannie around as she goes all these different places in the first hour after the earthquake. And that was all, she had just narrated that experience in a couple different places right after the quake, just, put it down for posterity. And I just walked around with those papers, just like, and taking photographs of, even though much had changed, like it was interesting for me to say like, okay, well here she says she, turned toward the mountains, and like, okay, so right there, just to kind of embody it in some ways. And that was completely not necessary, but I guess that gets back to your other question. It was like, it was just really fun, and I could afford to do it, and I was going to do it because I felt like, if anything, it just gave me a confidence that I could write this story, because I had been there, and I had, it was, I had experienced it to some weird, faint, vicarious way. In terms of like how I organized it, it was just, the main thing I did was I just made one giant timeline where, as I looked through, I was photographing every piece of paper. So I had all these, digital copies of these documents. And as I looked through them, I would just type notes into this timeline of, what happened when. So if I was reading one of these accounts of Jeannie, I was just, trying to timestamp as best I could, like, okay, between 8 and 8:15 or whatever. And that document just became enormous over time, because there was just so much to work with. So to the point where, it was thousands and thousands of words sometimes, just about like 1 hour, because I had so many different people's stories of what was going on during that hour. And so you sort of had this panorama. And yeah, so that was the main thing I did, was just pour everything into this one thing. And then I could just look through it and read the, almost like this biblical story of the quake. And as I was writing, I could, if I got to a certain point in the story, I could look back at that really easily and see what else was going on, across town or somewhere else. So that was the main tool. I couldn't, the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was some much better way to do it. Maybe some software I should have put in the time to learn, or, something, some tool or some insight that I could have had that would have made it look a little less like I was a crazy person. But that was what I did. Yeah.
Elliot has a question. Would you have had a book if you hadn't found the box of documents? I assume he means the boxes in Jan's basement that belonged to Jeannie.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. Well, I wouldn't have had this book. There probably would have been another way to tell the story of the quake, and Jeannie would have featured into that just because, of the prominence she had that weekend. But in terms of really getting to bring her out as like a protagonist, I don't think so at all, no.
And there was a question from Laurel. How has the book been received in Anchorage?
Oh, well, this was one of the big shames of the pandemic was, I was supposed to go up to Alaska and do all these, bookstore things and dinner things. And I just really, that's the one thing that's really stung, that I haven't been able to let go of too much, is that all that's been canceled. I'm still hoping to get up there maybe when the paperback comes out. But yeah, I've heard just really wonderful things from people up there. I think that it's a place, I think, that's still, there's a lot of pride of place in Anchorage, is my sense. People really love where they live, and they love the history of their community. And there are still, a lot of people there who, were either kids during the quake or just kind of old timers. So yeah, I haven't really heard anything negative about it, which was surprising, honestly, because I also think it wouldn't have surprised me if Anchorage is also a place that, would be a little bit suspicious of an outsider telling its story. But that just has not happened, at all, to my knowledge. So it's been great. Yeah. And especially during the pandemic, like I remember I got an email from this guy who said he had, when people started kind of locking down up there, he was just driving around leaving people he knew copies of the book, which I thought was really, really cool. So.
There's a comment here from Elise. I enjoyed this book as my husband and I eloped in Earthquake Park in Alaska. So
Wow.
Personal connection there.
Yeah.
So it's getting towards it's at the top of the hour, so we need to wrap up to respect everyone's time. But I just want to close by asking you, is there anything for all the people that have not read the book or maybe that have read it, anything in particular that you want to put in their heads, things you want them to wonder or notice as they're reading it, or you just...
No, I mean, I was saying to you before, it's like, it's always just really gratifying and like still like very humbling and amazing that people spend time with a book that I wrote. And, I get really curious and interested in people's responses to it, positive and negative. I don't feel a lot of, I don't have any compulsion to kind of like direct people how to read it or, so no, I mean, I hope you all enjoy it and find it worthwhile. And yeah, I'll be curious when we next get together to hear, people's questions and reactions.
Well, I want to thank everybody that attended tonight, and thank you for all the great questions. I want to let everybody know that you can get the book through all 3 of the libraries. We have lots of copies. There is probably going to be a little bit of a wait time, but we have all 3 libraries just ordered more copies. You can request them through the library. If you go to the website of any of them, there will be a link to the community read. None Such Books in Mill Creek is selling the book as well, and I was told today they just had to reorder more copies. And I was also told that if you're purchasing the book, do not be shy about telling them it is for the community read, and they will give you your discount. You can also purchase the books from Print Bookstore in Portland, which is a bookstore in my neighborhood that is excellent, and they're also offering a discount on the book. And wanted to let everybody know that we are adding all sorts of events. We just added book discussion groups yesterday and today. So if you go on the websites for the libraries, you will find the book discussion groups. We are also going to be having community read alouds of the book. So the schedule for that will be online. And there's going to be all sorts of related programming that we're going to be posting over the next few days and weeks. And Jon will be back with us again in the not too distant future. And so I want to thank all the attendees. I want to thank all the panelists, and Jon Mooallem. I want to thank you so much for being here and spending this evening with us.
Thank you all very much. Again, I'm so thrilled that you selected this book. So I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Jon. Everybody out there, be well and have a great evening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Jon. Thank you, Andy.